As the evening descended, a thick fog enveloped Skid Row of Avalon City, where dilapidated houses stood in disrepair and the air felt heavy, as if bound by the chains of poverty. The cold, biting wind cut through the alleys, slipping into every nook and cranny, making the makeshift tarps on the porches tremble. Inside the luxury car, making its way through the gloomy streets, Barron Trump sat motionless, deep in thought, as if caught in an inner struggle. Then, like an unexpected apparition, a figure caught his gaze. Amid the chaos, the people wandering aimlessly, he saw a woman, wrapped in a thin blanket. The woman huddled under a porch, her eyes full of longing, as if she had endured untold pain. A strange feeling overwhelmed Barron, as though a piece of his long-buried memory had suddenly awakened. At that moment, an unexpected thought crossed his mind, a feeling that life truly could change in an instant. Everything he had once believed could vanish in a heartbeat, like a fierce wave sweeping everything within reach. He had thought about it before, but he had never seen it so clearly, so close, and so real. His gaze shifted, but the weight of the feeling lingered. Something inexplicable kept him from remaining indifferent. The small details on her face, the wrinkles carved by years of hardship, seemed to etch themselves deeply into his mind, preventing him from continuing his journey. And then, a spark ignited in his mind, like a lightning bolt striking his consciousness. He realized who she was. A rush of pain and shock quickly flooded Barron's heart. It was Mrs. Thompson, his first teacher, the one who had taught him to read and write, who had instilled self-belief in him when everyone else around him was indifferent. She had stood by him during the darkest times, helping him overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable. He gripped the armrest tightly, his eyes locked onto the woman. The scene before him was almost impossible to believe. She, someone who had devoted her life to education. Why was she forced to endure this cold? Why did people like her have to suffer such a cruel fate? Barron's chest tightened with an indescribable sorrow. The world was indeed unfair. Where noble people, those who dedicated their lives to a noble cause, were trampled and forgotten in the dark corners of society. He couldn't ignore it. His gaze followed her, unable to turn away from the injustice unfolding before him. The car came to a stop at a red light. Barron didn't have time to think, as intense emotions overpowered his rational thoughts. He looked at her, seeing her thin, trembling hands clutching the fragile blanket, protecting her body from the bone-chilling cold, as if she were fighting an invisible battle that only she understood. Her body curled in the cold, yet her eyes shone with a hidden strength no one could see. In that moment, Barron's mind became completely clear. He could no longer turn a blind eye. He opened the car door and stepped out, his heart filled with a powerful feeling, an irresistible urge. His actions could change everything. Mrs. Thompson's life used to be a symphony of peaceful mornings and warm evenings spent with family. Her house stood nestled between the calm streets of Brighton City, where the sunlight always bathed every corner in gold. Each morning, she woke up when the first rays of sunlight peeked through the window, brewed a cup of hot coffee, and sighed with relief in front of the old lesson plan board, ready for another day of inspiring others. Her work was not just teaching, it was the journey of nurturing dreams, the moments of awakening desires in her students. Her life, seemingly peaceful, was a series of moments full of hope and simple happiness. But life, like an unpredictable tsunami, swept everything away. First, the cruel illness, silent but as powerful as the wind, took away all her dreams. The disease forced her to give up the classroom she had dedicated her life to abandon the job she loved. Before she could even begin to heal, an even greater pain struck, the sudden death of her beloved husband. And she, left alone in the empty house, where the walls no longer echoed with laughter, only the whispers of memories. The children, those she had once hoped would care for her in difficult times, gradually became faint shadows. At first, they still called, reassuring her that everything would be fine. But gradually, those calls became fewer, then disappeared completely, like a passing breeze. When she had to face the frailty of her body, when waves of pain battered her every day, she had to sell her house to afford the treatment. The hope for help from her children was crushed as every time she called them, she received nothing but cold silence and indifferent rejections. Her heart shattered in the indifference of those who had once been her greatest comfort. No family, no wealth, No health. She seemed to sink deeper into the darkness. With nowhere to turn, a shelter for the needy seemed like the only place where she could seek refuge. At first, she felt like a failure. Like a useless person, unworthy of being there, but she told herself this was just temporary. One day, I will rise up and find myself again, she thought, but life does not always understand. That shelter, where she sought comfort, turned out to be a dark and dangerous place. The screams around her, the shouting from desperate people, and the fights for scraps of food made her feel like a leaf caught in a storm. Each passing night, she grew more fearful, afraid of the bad things that could happen. But no matter what, she endured, trying to hold on to the faintest glimmer of hope. But fate would not let her rest. A fire suddenly broke out, consuming everything she had left, her papers, her photos, even the small suitcase containing her clothes. Everything turned to ash, and there was nothing left. And that was how Mrs. Thompson ended up in Skid Row of Avalon City, where the light of hope seemed to have completely faded. The streets were littered with trash, the air heavy, filled with the stench of misery. The dim street lights only seemed to emphasize the desolation, the coldness of the place. A place where people fought every day to survive, where dreams were ultimately extinguished. Ms. Thompson stood silently in the street, feeling like an anonymous grain of sand in an endless desert. No one noticed her anymore. No one remembered the efforts, the dreams she had once pursued. But in that darkness, she heard something small inside herself. No matter what, she still had a strength, a determination to survive, even though she knew the road ahead was full of hardships. Ms. Thompson couldn't stop asking herself, how had it come to this? A woman who had dedicated her life to teaching generations of students. Why was she now facing this fate? Alone to the point of despair? The answer was too bitter. But it was easy to recognize, the world had forgotten her. But it wasn't hunger. It wasn't the bone-chilling cold. And it wasn't the cruel diseases that were the scariest things. It was the unbearable loneliness. The kind that words couldn't even describe. The night in District A was an unending darkness. The cold cut into her skin as if the world itself wanted to tear apart each layer of flesh. Bit by bit, the ground where she lay was cold and rough, seeming to have nothing but the debris of life. Broken bottles, and lifeless trash. The heavy stench of urine, mold, and despair seemed to follow her through each long night. Every night brought a new storm, arguments, screams in the dark, and stealthy footsteps making the wind howl through the air like signs of impending danger. Ms. Thompson lay still, clutching her old fabric bag. Even though she knew it could not protect her from anything, she started avoiding looking into the eyes of those around her, as if a mere glance would shatter her. At first, she tried to maintain some dignity, choosing the least tattered clothes, trying to find ways to bathe in public places. But then, she realized that all those efforts were just meaningless gusts of wind. What she had tried to cling to no longer mattered. This city had turned its back on her, as if she no longer belonged to this world. She had sought out pleading gazes, but all she received were looks of avoidance. No comforting words, no gestures of care. Each time, she felt like an invisible grain of sand, unnoticed by anyone. That invisibility hurt more than the cold that pierced to her bones. As each day passed, she felt herself slowly disappearing, like a ghost fading in the crowd. She wondered whether she was still a person or just a soulless body. Lost in this world, the hunger gnawed at her relentlessly, like a monstrous beast weighing heavily on her heart. She had never thought that one day she would have to rummage through trash bins to find a morsel of food. The first time she did it, she felt a lump in her throat, the shame rising and blurring her vision. But life didn't wait for anyone. Hunger was the one thing that never forgave. And gradually, the humiliation became part of her survival journey. There were moments of luck, when someone passing by would give her a piece of bread, or sometimes volunteers would bring food. But those moments were never guaranteed. They came and went, like a breeze, leaving behind emptiness, a new despair. On those quiet late nights, Ms. Thompson couldn't remember the last time she felt warmth. Her stomach was empty, her body exhausted from the long nights without sleep. She lay still, feeling as if every bit of life inside her was slowly fading away. Time had not only taken her health, it had drowned her hope, stolen her faith, and quietly taken everything she had once been. She was no longer the teacher with sharp eyes, the one who inspired with her lessons. Now, She was just a faint shadow, almost invisible to this world. As the days passed, she lived in a world where everyone seemed to think she had nothing left to offer. Her words appeared to have lost their power, leaving only faint whispers when truly necessary. Her once bright eyes were now dull, as though there was nothing worth looking at. The outside world had completely abandoned her, and she didn't know how much longer she could endure. But one cold winter's day, as she sat curled up on a dark sidewalk in District A wrapped in a tattered old blanket, no one imagined that an encounter would completely change her fate. A luxurious car suddenly stopped, and Barron Trump, her former student, saw a sight he could hardly believe. There, sitting by the sidewalk, was Mrs. Thompson, his teacher, whom he had once admired as an ideal model of intellect and virtue. Now, she was just an elderly woman, trembling from the cold, sitting as if she had been completely forgotten. Barron felt a lump in his throat, as though the world had suddenly collapsed. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. His teacher, who had taught him not just academic lessons but also great values in life, was now just a ghost. He hurriedly opened the car door and stepped out, ignoring the curious glances of the people around him. With each step closer to her, he felt as though he was walking backward into the past. When he stood right in front of her, his heart felt like it was about to leap out of his chest. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked breath. "Mrs. Thompson, is it really you?" She slowly raised her head. Her eyes dimmed from exhaustion, but she still recognized the person before her. Her voice was weak, tinged with surprise and confusion. Not the voice Barron had once heard in the classroom. "Barron, is it you?" A moment of silence passed, and she looked at him as if trying to reconnect all the memories that had faded with time. Tears fell down her hollow cheeks, not from emotion, but from shame, the realization that a chapter of her life had ended, and the image she had once been had now been buried. She quickly hid her dirty hands in the blanket, as if trying to erase the reality before her. But no matter how hard she tried, what had happened couldn't be changed. The pain wasn't in the realization, but in being recognized by a student, someone who had once looked up to her and regarded her as an irreplaceable role model. Now, she was just a shadow of herself, an inevitable fading she could not hide. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart grow heavy as she saw Barron, her former student, standing before her with a look full of concern and tenderness. She didn't want him to see her in such a deplorable state, because what she had become was truly a shock. The woman who once stood strong and confident through countless challenges was now just the shadow of herself. On the brink of crumbling, she looked down, feeling the scars that time and hardship had left on her body and soul. The long, endless days had stolen her trust in humanity, in hope, and in life itself. Barron did not look away, as most people would when confronted with something uncomfortable. He didn't seem disturbed or unwilling to see her in this condition. Instead, he gazed at her with a deep, thoughtful look, as if wanting to understand all the pain she had carried through her long years of darkness. In that moment, the two worlds, two completely different stories, seemed to merge into one, indistinguishable from the past and the present. "Come with me," Barron said, his voice strong but warm, like an invitation with no pressure. Mrs. Thompson felt her head spin. His words pushed her into a crossroads she was not prepared for. She had learned not to trust anyone's promises, not to place hope in the help of others. But Barron's eyes, those of a former student, were like the only ray of light in this dreary world. She stared at him, her eyes full of doubt, as if everything she had been through had caused her to lose trust in anything. But his hands, though silent, seemed ready to lift her from this abyss. A choice formed in her heart without words. This was the only opportunity. In the end, she could not refuse anymore. The heavy fatigue in her heart left her with no strength to resist. And with a breath full of effort, she slowly reached out, allowing him to take her hand. It was the first handshake in years. Not of disdain, not of rejection, but of empathy, of protection. Barron helped her into the car, her steps slow, but he was like a shield, guarding her from everything. When the car began to move, the air fell into silence. But this time, the silence was not an empty void. It held so many unspoken words, an understanding without the need for speech. After a long time, Barron spoke, gently as a cool breeze. "Mrs. Thompson, can you tell me what happened?" She looked out the window, her eyes lost in the darkness. silent. But then, she began to speak, each word falling like a heavy stone. She told him about the illness that had tormented her day by day. About the death of the husband she had once loved. About the children she had raised, but who had turned their backs when she needed them most. Each story was like a sharp knife cutting into Barron's heart, making him unable to imagine. Barron stayed silent, not knowing what to say. He had heard stories like this, but not from people like Mrs. Thompson. Everything was so harsh, so cruel. Pain did not discriminate between who deserved it or not. All he could do was remain silent, realizing that not everything bright was the truth. When Mrs. Thompson opened up, telling about the husband who took away all her last hopes in life, her story sounded like a sad song, without melody, without echo. Barron Trump felt a tightness in his throat, as though the air was being sucked out, leaving a cold emptiness in his heart. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to lose everything, to feel as though a fire had burned out, leaving only ashes. However, what stunned him wasn't the story itself, but the way she told it. Not a trace of anger, not a hint of rage, only an endless exhaustion, as if she no longer had the strength to express it. When Mrs. Thompson stopped, her gaze didn't find him, but instead wandered out the window, as if she were waiting for a judgment, waiting for him to reproach her, to place blame. But Barron remained silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if his fingers were holding onto a storm of emotions. He couldn't let this story end like this. He couldn't let Mrs. Thompson continue to bear this injustice. The expression on his face changed, becoming resolute, as if he had decided what he would do to change her fate. Without much thought, Barron suddenly drove to a luxurious hotel in the heart of Avalon City. A place where people like Mrs. Thompson rarely set foot. She looked around, her eyes hesitant, as if she didn't belong there. It was a space so foreign, so vast compared to the life she had lived. "Let's go," Barron spoke, leaving no room for doubt in his voice. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her feet covered in dirt, her clothes torn. She felt like an outsider, like a ghost who couldn't blend in. But Barron didn't allow her to continue avoiding it. He extended his hand, no longer questioning, just patience that couldn't be broken. "Please," he said, his eyes full of pleading. Mrs. Thompson stared into his eyes for a long time, then slowly stepped forward. A sense of self-worth, something she hadn't felt in a long time, suddenly rose within her. When they entered the hotel, curious eyes glanced over. Some whispered, but Barron didn't care. He walked straight to the front desk and requested an extravagant room. Not because of the luxury, but simply because she deserved it. A warm blanket, a fresh meal, a safe space, these were the basics. The things Mrs. Thompson needed right now. Mrs. Thompson wrapped herself in the robe as if seeking some form of protection. When they reached the room, she glanced back at Barron, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. "Why are you doing all of this for me?" Her voice was weak, both surprised and emotional. Barron took a deep breath, then gently answered, "Because you've always believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it. Now it's time for me to do that for you." Tears unexpectedly fell down her cheeks. She wanted to say she didn't need this, but each silent tear was the answer. She needed it, more than anything else. She entered the bathroom, and as the warm water touched her skin, she felt a part of her being cleansed. It was a strange feeling, as if her body and soul were being reborn. Her fingers glided over the mirror, looking at the reflection she hadn't recognized in a long time. When she stepped out, her body clean, wrapped in new clothes, with a meal waiting, she felt something very strange, dignity. A feeling as if she had regained a part of herself. She looked at Barron, and in that moment, she understood that everything that had happened today was not a dream. But Barron knew that it was only the beginning. He didn't just want to give her a peaceful night, he wanted to give her a new life. He took his phone, contacting lawyers, doctors, and social organizations. He would protect her, help her rebuild from scratch. But in his heart, something had changed forever. It wasn't just for her. It was for himself. The early morning light streamed through the window, casting a gentle, pure golden glow across the room. Mrs. Thompson slowly opened her eyes, her gaze dreamy as if trying to regain her clarity in the unfamiliar space. When the familiar feeling returned, she realized she was no longer in the old place. The bed was soft, the blanket clean, and the quiet air was nothing like the A district where she had lived those long, anxious, and painful days. A sense of confusion enveloped her. Did she deserve this help? How could she ever repay everything Barron had done for her? The door creaked open, and a warm voice rang out. "Did you sleep well?" Barron walked in, his face beaming, showing no signs of exhaustion despite all that he had done for her. Mrs. Thompson flinched a little. But soon after, she felt a sense of peace. A calmness. Looking into Barron's eyes, she couldn't hide the gratitude in her heart. He had done everything to help her find life again. From taking her to the doctor, finding her a safe place to stay, and not stopping there, Barron had also helped her restore her faith in herself. That feeling wasn't about money or material things, but about the genuine care and priceless help he had given her. For the first time in many years, she felt like she was part of this world, no longer invisible. As time passed, Mrs. Thompson gradually changed, no longer the tired, worn woman she used to be. Now she was full of life. The most noticeable changes were in her eyes and her smile. She had found a job at a community organization, where she could inspire children, help those struggling. She felt like she was regaining strength with every piece of chalk. As if a part of her soul had awakened. Once, when Barron asked her why he was doing all of this, Mrs. Thompson hesitated, but he simply answered gently, "You helped me see the value of a person. Now I just want to help you realize yourself." Their meeting wasn't a coincidence, but proof that small, meaningful actions could change a whole life. What Barron had done for her wasn't just about helping her stand up, but about bringing back the hope and self-respect that had been lost for so long. She was no longer just a pitiful woman, but a woman who could change her own life, and even the lives of those around her. This story isn't just about helping, but about the connection of kindness, the ability to give and receive, and ultimately about the resurrection of a person from the rubble. Life sometimes leads us into dark corners, but it is the small, simple acts and unconditional kindness that can light the way, helping us find hope and strength to begin again. Mrs. Thompson and Barron's story is a clear testament to how a kind gesture can change a life. Not just of one person, but of everyone around them. Remember, no matter how difficult the circumstances, we can always find the light if we open our hearts and give. If you love these inspiring stories, don't forget to hit subscribe and follow our channel so you don't miss any meaningful new videos. Thank you for following. Note: this is a fictional story created for entertainment and carries positive messages about kindness, help, and change.